I like to, I don't speak English well. Most of my work is in mathematics. So I'm actually very uncomfortable using words. So forgive me for what is going to follow. So there's a famous painting by an artist named Magritte, and it's a painting of a pipe, that men smoke, and the title is "This is not a pipe." So for the most part, my talk will not be a talk about the Euro crisis. I'm going to spend very little time talking about the Euro crisis. Okay, that's where I'm going. But before before I don't talk about the Euro crisis, let me just tell you about the situation in Europe now. Europe has a monetary union. There's 23 countries, if you count the Vatican. There's a European Central Bank called the ECB. There's an extremely weak central government. It's in Brussels. It has virtually no capacity to tax or to spend. Extremely weak. The power to tax and spend lies completely in 23 subordinate national governments that are sovereign states. Their names are Germany, Italy, France, and following you, I'll leave it as a homework problem to do the other 23 minus 3, 20. And usually, oftentimes when teachers say, I'm going to use it as a homework problem, it means that they don't know the answer. Okay. So the situation is in Europe, there's a weak center that can't tax or can't spend very much. That's the law. There are big debts that the subordinate governments have. Greece, Italy, France, Spain, and so on. Extremely large debts. Those debts trade at deep discounts, some more than less. That's why they promise high. You'll see the rates of return are supposedly high. That means the risk's high. By the way, anytime you see a very high promised rate of return, you should ask, what's the risk? Well, the risk there is that the debt's not going to be paid by anybody. And then finally, there's obscure, that means unclear, European policies toward bailouts and toward disciplining countries. That's how I see Europe today, and I'm not going to mention Europe much more. So there's questions that are age-old that face European voters today. There are the questions about who pays what. There's struggles about sovereignty that you don't hear much in the press, but they are there. There's struggles about the generosity of welfare states, and there's questions about what Europe is to be, profound questions. So one way to think about the future, there's much uncertainty. We know little about the future, and maybe we can learn something about the future from the past. So I'm going to do an extensive example from the past, and I'm going to talk about some history from North America, my own country. So, but before I do that, as was said, if you read the newspapers today, questions about the euro are there with many, many details that are hard to penetrate to find out what's essential and what's not. So I'm going to tell you what I think is essential. This is one person's opinion. So there's four fundamental questions, really two, in Europe. There are questions in Europe, but they're perennial questions for every government. The first is, should governments default on their debts? The second is, should a central government bail out subordinate states? You should have opinions on those. And then there's two more questions that I view as sideshow questions. They're less important. Should a monetary union precede a fiscal union? Should a fiscal union precede a monetary union? I'm kind of cheating. Is that two questions or one? Okay, so those questions are going to be behind. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you, now when I show you this next slide, I do not want you to look at anything in red. This is the honor system. Don't look at anything in red. Only look at things above the line. So I'm going to tell you some things about American history. I'm going to talk about basically from 1776, when we were a British colony. We were 13 British colonies, and we fought a war of independence. We won our independence. We wrote a constitution called the Articles of Confederation. That was our constitution. Then we ripped it up and wrote a second constitution. Why? I'm going to focus on that. And then we started running that constitution. Then some other stuff happened. So that's the history I'm going to talk about. And that's a history in which the United States was born. And I'm going to argue that the fundamental questions that were addressed were number 1 and number 2. And we had some very smart people, and they gave answers to both those questions. So this is logic. There's 2 possible questions to number 1 and number 2. Yes and no, and yes and no. And economics is just organized common sense underneath all the math. So the question is, what are the costs of doing such and such, and what are the benefits? And then the question is, cost to whom and benefits to whom? So different people might answer yes, and different people might answer no. So now, that's the end of my talk. But I must go on. So you watch for those questions to come up, okay? Okay, so I'm going to skip some math. So what I'm going to skip some math. These slides are basically there about the math, are basically to protect me from people who are engineers and scientists, to let them know that economics actually does use some math. So I'm going to tell, but I'm going to summarize the math in some words. So the question is, what determines the value of a government debt or of any debt? You could ask yourself. And this isn't rocket science. Well, the answer is, well, you could think about it by looking backwards or looking forwards. And they're both valid ways of looking at it. A government or a person, like you, has high debt today because you borrowed a lot in the past. You spent more than your income in the past. That leads you to have high debt today. If you're an engineer or something, I'm solving a differential equations backwards. The question is, if you have high debt today, why would anybody in his good mind ever lend to you today? Well, they think you're going to pay it off in the future. So high debt today signals that relative to your income tomorrow, you're going to spend less. So what you're going to do is you're going to use the difference between your spending, your income tomorrow, and your spending tomorrow, a big stream, to pay off your debt. So high debts today signal that in the past, you spent more than you earned, and that in the future, you're going to earn more than you spend. So high government, if we apply this to a person, or to a country, or to a company. So so that's the basic theory of the valuation of a bond. That's the basic bond price model. So now the question is, if you see the price of government bonds fall, as they have been falling recently in Spain and Italy, the reason is the holders of those bonds think it's less likely that they're going to be paid in the future. Now, what's going to govern whether they're going to be paid in the future? It's whether the government of Italy, I'll come back to this, is going to tax enough in the future relative to its expenditures to service the bonds. Does everybody understand that? You know, if you borrow to finance a house, or I think of it within the family. If you lend your brother money now, it's because he's spending more now than he did in the past. He's spending more than he earned, and he's relying on you to give him the money. But it's a good idea to lend it to him, if you expect anything back, only if he's going to be more prudent in the future. That's it. So the way we say this technically is the value of government debt equals the expected present value of future government surpluses. So high government debt today signals stringency in the future. That's arithmetic that cannot be denied. It is not ideological. Okay. So now the question is, because I want to be fancy, I'm going to call the government surplus. What I mean by the government surplus is government tax collections minus government expenditures. And if you're a finance major, that's a dividend stream that's backing, that's the interest payment stream that's backing the bonds of the government. I'm going to call it S, government surpluses. So now the question is,